The animated discussion that in recent times has taken place about the figure of Colombo, at the presence of monuments dedicated to him, has grown, in my opinion, in a unsatisfactory, or I think better wrong manner, comprised of immovable defenses and attacks without historical context. In this first meeting, we asked a great historian, an expert in the period of exploration and the conquests, Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, to trace a portrait of Cristoforo Colombo beyond geography and immigration. The second talk will take place on December 8th and will be dedicated to a more general discussion on memory, monuments, and community. Felipe Fernandez Ernesto is William P. Reynolds Professor of History at Notre Dame University, and his most recent works are The Word, A Brief History, Amerigo, the man who gave his name to America, 1492, the year of the word began, and Our America, a Hispanic history of the United States. The title of the speech tonight will be The Seven Secrets of Christopher Colombo. So please welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very kind introduction, and it's a great treat to be here. It's such a lovely building and so worthy of housing a serious cultural institute like this one. I feel very honored to be here. My title is, of course, ironic, and the inverted commas are meant to distance me from the word secrets. Because, of course, the first secret of Christopher Columbus is that there are no secrets. He's really an extremely knowable figure by the standards of other comparable figures of the time, other explorers. He's supremely well documented. And anybody who tells you that there are a lot of secrets in Columbus's story and a lot of mysteries to unravel is probably trying to justify outrageous and invalid speculations. Of course, there are puzzles in the sources that we haven't yet solved. Such as, for example, this is one of the most famous so-called mysteries of Columbus, his famous mystical signature that he adopted towards the end of his life and that he urged his heirs to employ. But he never explained what it means, and historians have puzzled over it. We can come back to it later if you like, and talk about some of the possible interpretations of this. There are also these famous or notorious little squiggles which he wrote on his letters to his elder son, which have been interpreted by some readers as secret codes in Hebrew cursive. But whether that is the case, and if so, what those squiggles really mean, remain unsolved problems of the history of Columbus. In general, however, we just know an enormous amount about him. In fact, I would say that we know almost infinitely more about him than any other explorer of his time, a considerable amount more even than Vespucci. As the director said, I've also written a biography of Vespucci, and really those are the only two figures in this world at that time who have generated enough material and have left enough documents to be suitable subjects for biography. And in Columbus's case, the reasons for that are first of all because he was famous in his own day, and therefore documents from his hand became precious and worthy of being kept, unlike those of most other explorers of the time. In the second place, his life left a legacy of lawsuits which went on for generations, lawsuits in which his heirs contended with the Spanish crown for the rewards which Columbus claimed were due to him for his services. And so all those lawsuits generated an enormous amount of documentation. In the third place, we have to thank the author of this document, Bartolomé de las Casas, the official protector of the native peoples of the Spanish monarchy in the New World, the great spokesman for the rights of what the Spaniards at the time called indios. And Las Casas was what we would now call Columbus's literary executor, and collected an enormous amount of Columbus's work, including what you see here, which is Las Casas's digest of Columbus's vast account of his first transatlantic crossing. And the rest of that document has not come down to us, and most of it survives only in Las Casas's transcription. But he included a great many of Columbus's own words in that transcription. And finally, we know a lot about Columbus because he poured his heart and soul into his writings. He was a kind of obsessive autobiographer who couldn't stop writing about himself. And again, this is quite unusual for someone of such modest social origins and such a modest profession as that of explorer at the time. Now, of course, most of what he wrote in these heartfelt autobiographical outpourings was lies. But do know, ladies and gentlemen, lies divulge more than the truth. Because, you know, if you lie to me about yourself, well, say, if you tell me the truth about yourself, all I know is the truth you want me to know. But as soon as you lie to me, I also know, provided I have sufficient critical acumen to detect the fact that you're lying, when you lie to me, I also know what you are trying to conceal and what you are trying to hide, on your evasions and those real secrets that you wish to occlude from your readers. So don't let anybody tell you that Columbus is a mysterious or unknown figure. In particular, don't let anybody tell you that his birthplace was a secret. He was Genoese. I mean, not only does he tell us repeatedly that he was born in Genoa. Well, obviously, he may have been wrong about that. I mean, they tell me that I was born in St. Mary Abbott's Hospital, but I was too young at the time to remember, and I presume the same was the case with Columbus. So maybe we shouldn't trust his own memories. But almost everybody who knew him well in his lifetime, who attributes a place of origin, a birthplace to him, says it was Genoa, including, you know, friends of his youth like Michele de Cuneio, who was Savanese and who accompanied Columbus on one of his voyages. And there's a huge paper trail in Genoese archives about a Cristoforo Colombo, who was the son of a weaver, and whose life in every particular corresponds with that of the Columbus who made these famous transatlantic voyages. And if that's not enough to convince you that he really came from Genoa, there's an incontrovertible document which is a statement by his brothers. Back home in Genoa, his brothers Bartolomeo and Giacomo, saying that they are going to go to Spain to meet up with him and to try and gain some patronage from their successful brother. Now, people who won't believe all of that evidence, nonetheless, are perfectly willing to invent phony Columbuses. You know, a Greek Columbus, a Catalan, a Galician, a Scottish, a Polish Columbus, for whom there's no evidence at all. And they do that on the grounds that they don't consider this vast amount of evidence that associates him with Genoa to be satisfactory. But it's more than that, ladies and gentlemen. Unless you acknowledge, unless you understand that he was Italian, and perhaps particularly unless you understand he was Genoese, you cannot understand anything else about him, because his life only makes sense against an Italian provenance. First of the two reasons. First of all, because being Italian locates him in the context of a really crucial aspect of late medieval and early modern global exploration. The fact that Atlantic exploration started from the mid-Mediterranean. It was exclusively Italian and Majorcan navigators who began the exploration of the high Atlantic in the 14th century. And very gradually in the 15th century, this initiative, this baton, as it were, passed into the hands of Atlantic side navigators, especially Spanish and Portuguese ones. But the Italian participation continued into the early 16th century, and really, you can only understand Columbus if you realize that he's part of that last great couple of generations of Italian participants in Atlantic exploration, who included Vespucci and Verrazzano and Cabot, the discoverer of a North Atlantic route from England to Newfoundland. And of course, Columbus's own father-in-law, Bartolomeo Perestrello, who came from Piacenza. And the second reason why you can't understand Columbus unless you appreciate his Italian background is that without fitting in to a circle of Italian friends in the Italian diaspora in Andalusia, and especially in Seville in the late 15th century, Columbus would never have found a community to support him when he went to Spain. For example, the key financiers who backed his first transatlantic crossing were the Florentine Gianotto Berardi. I'm very happy to be able to pay tribute to the director's native city, and the Genoese Francesco da Rivarolo, who between them put up most of the money for Columbus's first voyage. Now, not only, therefore, does one have to appreciate that Columbus was born in Genoa, you also have to appreciate that he was of modest social origins as well. Now, I mean, he created a certain amount of obfuscation about his ancestry by dropping hints that he had great noble ancestors, and we'll see in a moment why he did that. But it was quite untrue. His family was almost certainly this weaving family, the family of Domenico and Susanna Colombo. And you have to understand that he came from a modest background, because that's what explains why he became an explorer. And why he was willing to risk his life on this extraordinary venture into the Atlantic. You know, in order to sail the high Atlantic in the 15th century, you had either to be ignorant or desperate, and Columbus was both. He was desperate for social advancement. That's the great driving force of Columbus's life. It's none of the things that you find in the conventional historiography. It's not science. It's not, as I hope to show you in a moment if I have time, religion. It's not imperialism. It's not even the search for wealth, except as an adjunct to social status. What he really wanted was to be a nobleman. As his crew complained on his first voyage, according to one of these fragments of his writings that have survived from the time. His crew complained that he was risking all their lives in order to make himself a great lord. And they were exactly right. That was exactly what he was trying to do. That was exactly what he wanted to do. That's why he struggled for years to get patrons who would guarantee him ennoblement as a reward for his services. And you know, he writes, when he finally gets an agreement from the King and Queen of Spain, he writes to them, as it were, confirming his contract, something which I've just done with the Istituto Italiano. He writes confirming the terms of his contract, and it's all about how you have agreed that I shall be called Don, and I shall be Viceroy and Admiral of the Ocean Sea. These were the things that mattered to him more than wealth, more than God, more than the success of the monarchs whom he served. He had two models in mind when he embraced the vocation of explorer. You know, in this period, if you wanted to escape into the acceptance world, if you wanted to realize lofty social ambitions, and you were just a poor boy, a weaver's son, like Columbus, basically there were three things you could do. There was war, there was the church, and there was exploration. And Columbus had two models of the socially successful kind of explorer before his eyes. The first was a real-life model, the model of the so-called knights and squires who had gathered around the Portuguese prince whom we now call Henry the Navigator. And amongst those, ne'er-do-wells, rogues, desperados, who, by taking service with Prince Henry, became knights and squires, and gave themselves fancy names and titles. Amongst those individuals was Columbus's own father-in-law, that Bartolomeo Perestrello, whom I mentioned a moment ago. So he had these real-life examples of social ascent achieved through exploration before his eyes. But I think perhaps even more pervasive, even more life-changing for Columbus was the influence of the kind of books he read when he was young. Romances of chivalry. The example I'm showing you here is of one which was actually published in 1493, so the year after Columbus's first transatlantic voyage. It's the Cárcel de Amor of Diego de San Pedro. And the reason I show you this, there's no evidence that Columbus read this one, but I show it to you because although it's a work of fiction, the woodcuts in the 1493 edition are based on the siege of Granada, which was, of course, a real-life episode, which concluded in January of 1492, and Columbus himself was there to see the city fall. And the artist modeled the king and queen in the story on the real-life figures of Ferdinand and Isabella. So this woodcut does take us close to Columbus's real experience, his real world. But the sort of books that he was reading, they were, hagiographical, seaborne adventures like the Navigation of St. Brendan, which he cites in his own writings, and the secularization of that saint's life, the Libro del Caballero Cífar, which Columbus also mentions, and the legend of St. Ursula, and of St. Eustace, who has a series of extraordinary seaborne adventures, but also secular romances of chivalry. And there were a lot of these around. These were what I call the station bookstall pulp fiction of the time. These are what every, modestly educated person like Columbus would read. And typically, they're stories set at sea, which start with a hero who is down on his luck. He's a foundling. He thinks that he's really a prince, or that he's entitled to greatness, just as Columbus claimed to be. You see, that's why he claims noble ancestry, because he's seeing himself already as the hero of one of these fictional romances. And the hero then seeks his fortune by taking to the sea, and he usually conquers islands, often fighting giants and monsters in the course of it, sometimes marrying a princess. Columbus didn't quite marry a princess, but he did manage to marry a minor noblewoman. So these are the models that Columbus had in his mind, and I think the single work that influenced him most was a Spanish romance of chivalry, the Libro de Alexandre, as it was called in Galician, which was a language in which it was written. When Columbus compares himself with Alexander, which he does a lot, he's not thinking of the classical hero. He didn't know enough about, ancient Greek history and literature to identify with the real Alexander. He was thinking of the hero of this chivalric romance. I'll just give you one illustration of this. One of the things that's always puzzled historians is that when, on his first voyage, the New World was first seen from the crow's nest at the end of this terribly long and dangerous voyage in which the crew thought they would never get home, when at last they saw the land, the sources are quite unequivocal. It was a sailor in the crow's nest who spotted the land, as you would expect. And the King and Queen of Spain had promised a small cash reward and a silk coat to whoever was the first sailor to see land. And Columbus claimed that reward. And people have always wondered why. Why was he so mean, that he would cheat this poor sailor out of this reward? And the answer is that in the romance of Alexander, Alexander doesn't go to India by land. He goes by sea. And he discovers the coast of India for himself. The text says, "Díjoles Alexandre de todos el más primero, que antes lo vio él, que ningún marinero." Up spoke Alexander, the first of all his crew, that he had seen the land before any seaman knew. So that's because Columbus wanted to be like Alexander. And that's the solution to this puzzle that has so bamboozled historians. Now, of course, this immersion in station bookstall pulp fiction reveals another secret about Columbus, which is that he was not well educated. Now, his great friend Andrés Bernaldez said of him that he was a man of little learning but great intellect. And I think that's probably right. He was an autodidact. He taught himself to read works of geography. But that was late in life, he didn't start doing that until he was in his 30s. And all the, myths about how he'd worked out through studying geography what he was going to do on his transatlantic voyage, that's all phony because he hadn't done most of that reading before. In fact, he did most of the reading when he came back and when he was trying to justify his claim for rewards before the King and Queen of Spain. Nor was he trained, instructed, or even competent as a navigator. This may seem counterintuitive, but Columbus knew very little about navigation. He set his prow to the west on the latitude that he thought was most likely to lead him to a successful destination, and he just kept going. And in order to keep on a westerly track, well, it's very difficult because leeway pushes you off course and so on. But basically, his technique was just to keep heading west. And he created this myth that he was a scientific navigator who used all the latest technology, all the newest scientific instruments of the day, quadrants and astrolabes. And again, a surviving description of his crew's attitude to him tells us that when they got impatient with him and contemplated throwing him overboard, they were going to throw him overboard with those instruments as well, because they were he used these things, these instruments, in order to create the impression that he had esoteric knowledge that the other seamen didn't have. Now, in this engraving, we are not seeing Columbus, we're seeing Vespucci. But this was one of the many ways in which Vespucci modeled himself on Columbus. And you can see how, this is how both Vespucci and Columbus wanted us to remember them. These lonely figures, almost sort of Christ-like figures, with their crew falling asleep like the apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane, whilst the Christ-like hero communicates with the heavens. But neither of them knew how to use these instruments. And in fact, we know how Columbus navigated. He used the passage of the guard stars around the pole star to calculate the hours of daylight. He then subtracted those from 24 to give him the hours of daytime at the latitude at which he found himself. And he then read his latitude off a set of printed tables that had been printed some years earlier in Ferrara, giving different latitudes according to the hours of daylight. And we know that that's what he did, because all the mistakes that he records in latitudes in his writings are the same as misprints in that set of tables. So all of this stuff, about navigating was completely phony. And I suppose this brings us to, another of his supposed secrets, which is, the secret of his motivation. And why did he do all this stuff? Well, as you know, I think it's because he was socially ambitious and he was seeking a means of social ascent, of achieving the rewards of ennoblement. But there is a pervasive tradition that highlights, that headlines religion as Columbus's driving force. And here we're seeing a famous painting by Dali, which is a very strong statement of that tradition. The director mentioned that I'm a professor in the University of Notre Dame, and if you've ever been there, you'll know that one of the great treasures of Notre Dame is a set of paintings by the Italian artist Luigi Gregorio, who came to Notre Dame in the 1870s and decorated the famous Basilica of Notre Dame and also the university buildings with these extraordinary murals celebrating Columbus's achievement in opening the new world to Christian evangelization. And of course that's true. I mean, Columbus did do that. But that wasn't his prime motive, at least not early in his career, not when he formulated and began to execute his plans for a transatlantic crossing. In fact, I cannot find any reference to religion, no mention of God, in anything that he wrote before 1492. The only possible thing is a reference that he's supposed to have made promising the king and queen of Spain that with the money that they'd get from his discoveries, they would be able to reconquer Jerusalem. And the king of Spain is said to have smiled at this, and historians have always interpreted this as an ironic smile, as if, the king thought, that's not very likely to happen. But really, I think the king was smiling with pleasure, because King Ferdinand, one of his titles, one of his hereditary traditional titles, was King of Jerusalem, and all Spanish formal edicts of the time begin with a description of King Ferdinand, King of Jerusalem. So I think what Columbus was doing, I don't think it was anything about religion on Columbus's part. He was telling the king what he knew would flatter him and what he knew would make him smile. But apart from that, you don't get any references to religion in Columbus's life until things begin to go wrong. In other words, he was like most of us. He turns to God when he's down on his luck and when he needs divine help. And on his first voyage, when he's on his way home and he's trapped in this terrible storm and he's thinking that he'll never get back, and the account he writes of this is full of how he feels he's never going to see his children again. That's the moment when he has his first so-called mystical experience. And from then on, his commitment to religion grows and grows, and I think certainly becomes extremely sincere towards the end of his life. He goes around a Franciscan habit. His writings become saturated in references to God. It's a bit like Cortés, Something similar happens to Cortés during the conquest of Mexico. When things go wrong and he begins to feel that he's not getting the rewards that he hoped for, that's the moment when Cortés takes on all this religious rhetoric, religious imagery, dare I use the word affectation, because that's what happens in Columbus's case. And that brings us, I suppose, to the question of what did he think he was doing when he set off on his voyage? Historians have always been surprised by all the contradictions in Columbus's writings. On the one hand, he insists that he was an absolutely constant, perseverant person who never changed his mind. He creates this myth of himself as persevering against critics, against skeptics, against the odds, and finally triumphing in a design from which he had never wavered. And yet, when you actually look at his writings, he seems always to be proposing completely different and mutually contradictory plans for how he's going to cross the Atlantic and what he's going to find when he gets there. And I think the solution to this problem is very simple. The myth of Columbus as a constant and persevering individual is a myth of his own creation. The phrase I use is the adamantine Columbus that we have inherited from tradition has to be rebuilt in mercury and opal. And the reason why he always seems to be changing his mind is that he really was always changing his mind. And that he changed his description of what he was going to do on this voyage according to the potential patron with whom he was negotiating. Like every good academic grant writer, you address the audience that's going to give you the money, and you play to their desires and their ambitions and their agenda. So at certain times, Columbus was doing what, this 15th century map of the Atlantic, which is full of speculative and non-existent islands, does. He was suggesting that maybe he could find new islands, which perhaps could be profitable. At other times, he was suggesting that he would find a new continent. Ironically, of course, that's what he eventually did find, the so-called Antipodes, which had been described in various classical geographical writings, but in the existence of which few professional geographers at the time believed. And at other times, he proposed that he would find a short route to China, which, if it had been possible, would have been very valuable, because China was the world's leading economy at the time, and the whole of the West was poor by comparison. Everybody wanted to open trade with China if they could. But of course it was too far away, and everybody knew that. People knew perfectly well how big the world was. That had been calculated accurately by Eratosthenes in ancient Alexandria. There was no doubt about that. So all of these plans of Columbus's, he kept switching between them, but none of them convinced a patron to back him until 1492, and the reason for that is that suddenly, in the 1480s, Atlantic exploitation, particularly sugar production in Madeira and the Canaries, whaling products and cod fisheries in the North Atlantic, the gold trade of the West African bulge, suddenly, in the 1480s, all of these activities began to yield profits. And that's why financiers were willing to put a little bit of money behind Columbus just to see if he did turn up something that might be useful. And they were willing to do that because he didn't matter. He was an insignificant weaver's son. And he was a cheap date. Because he didn't want a lot of money up front, he wanted titles of nobility. And of course, provided the king and queen were willing to give him those, it meant that his financial backers could, for a small outlay, hope for a substantial gain. That's what took Columbus across the Atlantic. And the fact is that all the debate about where he was going doesn't matter, or at least it didn't matter to him. He didn't really care whether he would find islands or mainland or China. What mattered to him was whether he would arrive in a social sense. And yet, in spite of all these limitations on the enterprise, it turned out to be one of the most spectacularly revelatory events in the history of the world. Because, of course, Columbus really did discover America. Now, all the debate about whether it's appropriate to talk about him discovering America is really, in my humble submission, pretty silly. Because, of course, you know, the people who lived in America already knew it was there. But even they had no conception of what this hemisphere was like, or how it fitted into the geography of the world. So Columbus really did discover America, not only for his fellow Europeans at the time, but for the whole world, including its own inhabitants, because one of the long-term effects of his voyage was that this revelation of what the world was like was shared amongst all its peoples, including Native American ones. But in any case, you know, to speak of discovering America really misses the point of what he did. Because what he really achieved was the discovery of a route to and from the New World, which was commercially exploitable, which was technically viable, and which, for the first time in the history of the world, united the densely populated belt that stretches across the old world from China to the Atlantic, with those densely populated areas of the New World which were just beyond his reach when he ended his exploring career. So, in order to appreciate the greatness of Columbus's achievements, you don't have to kid yourself about all the other myths. You know, the greatness of those achievements is conspicuous in spite of all the deconstruction that I've done for you today about his other so-called secrets. But you know, to me, the poignant note with which I'll leave you is that he was never satisfied. I mean, after all, not only did he achieve this world-changing discovery, he also achieved what he had set out to achieve, because he did become Don Cristobal and viceroy of the King of Spain, and admiral of the ocean sea, and he sired a race of dukes. He really did transcend his origins as a weaver's son and make it in an acceptance world, which must have seemed an extraordinary achievement to everybody else who beheld it, except him, because he was always dissatisfied. He was an inveterate complainer. You know, when you read his works, we historians, ladies and gentlemen, spend our lives talking to dead people. You know, we interrogate the sources they've left us with questions which we want them to answer for us. And I've spent many years talking to Columbus in this sense. And he annoys me so much because he complains all the time. You know, even when things are going well, he seems always to find things to complain about. And then when things are going badly, he's absolutely distraught, and he seems to forget all of his achievements and become immersed in and obsessed by his embitterment, his disappointment, his feeling that he had been despoiled of the honor and rewards that were due to him for his work. And so he died in suffering and misery. And it just makes me feel that the one secret that he really needed to know, but which he never learnt, was the secret of how to be happy.
You said that he was not really a navigator, that he was basically had all these instruments he didn't know how to use. Then was it sheer coincidence that he found that he was?
Yes, of course it was, because nobody knew it was there. Of course it was a coincidence. And he might have missed everything. You know, when he was sailing through the Caribbean, he could have missed all the islands, rather as Magellan did. You know, he missed scores of islands when he was sailing through the Pacific. He just sort of sailed between them, he never sighted any of them. And that might have happened to Columbus. It was less likely to happen to Columbus because he was sailing, by the end of his voyage, he was in an area which, I'm sorry, I have to, forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, I have to hold this microphone. It makes me look like Frank Sinatra or something. But it's because the event is being recorded. So he probably wouldn't have missed them because they're relatively densely packed in the Caribbean. But in the sense that he wasn't looking for them, yes, it was a kind of accident, it was a kind of coincidence. But you see, he used what the French historian of navigation, Paul Ladan, called navigation primitive célestielle. So he was using this method where you watch the guard stars surrounding the pole star, and that gives you, their motion gives you if you keep watching them all during the night, and you time when they appear and when they disappear, that gives you the hours of nightfall. And he then subtracted those from the hours of daylight, and that gave him a figure for latitude according to the hours of daylight. And he just read that off the tables. You know, people used to think, well, some people still think they're wrong, that he used the system of navigation called dead reckoning, where you just set a course and you time how long you travel on that course, and you estimate your speed, and that gives you your distance and enables you to plot where you've gone on a chart. I think he certainly tried to use that, but his main method was this primitive celestial navigation.
So how did he convince the king and the
Oh, well, the king and queen didn't give him any money. I mean, the famous story of Queen Isabella pawning her jewels, that's romantic drivel, you know. She wasn't that stupid, you know. The money all came from these bankers. Well, it was a consortium. As I say, the two main financiers were these Italians, Gianotto Berardi and Francesco da Rivarolo. And I think they put the money in because they thought it's not much money, and the Atlantic exploration has started yielding a lot of returns in the 1480s. A lot of money is being made. Maybe we can make some more with a little outlay. So it was nothing. I don't think anybody believed in any of these plans that Columbus had put forward. But there was always the chance that he might find something profitable. And the rest of the consortium was made up of courtiers who put together a supplementary amount of finance that paid for the supplies and the ships and so on. I beg your pardon, I don't know who was next. I think you, sir. May I go?
He was crazy. We went to school in Italy, you know, we were studying Colombo in the elementary school. He was crazy with discovering that the earth was not flat.
Oh, for God's sake.
Also, the anecdote L'uovo di Colombo. Any truth to that?
No, of course not. You know, there are more people today who believe that the earth is flat than there were in the 15th century. Yeah. Nobody thought that. It's one of the silliest myths that you could possibly hope to define. It started. You know how that myth started? It was invented as a joke by Washington Irving. You know? And of course it is the fate of the ironist to be taken au pied de la lettre, you know. And that's what happened. I mean, everybody knew the world was round. Any work on physics, astronomy, geography from that period will tell you the world is round. In fact, they overestimated its roundness because they thought it was a perfect sphere, which of course it isn't. It's it's an oblate spheroid. It's kind of orange shaped. It's kind of squashed at the end. So if anything, they overestimated the roundness of the world. I think this gentleman may have been next. Yes, sir.
In 1492 was exactly the time when the Jews were expelled from Spain. And there is a theory that many of his navigators were Jews who were Maranos and were professional scientists who helped him. And apart from this symbol that you said at the right corner of the letters that is right to his son.
Yes.
Is there any base to this theory?
Well, it's certainly true that, as always, Jews, considering what a small community we're talking about historically, have contributed a disproportionate amount to science. That is the most extraordinary fact about Jewish history. Jews have been preeminent in contributions to science. And that is certainly true of late medieval astronomy, navigation, and geography. We only know of one Jew on Columbus's first expedition, and that was the interpreter, who went along because the monarchs or the financial backers thought Columbus might meet some people who spoke Arabic or Hebrew, so they needed an interpreter who spoke those languages. Of course, this interpreter proved singularly useless on the expedition. So we don't know of any other Jews who took part in the expedition, but sure, I mean, a lot of the astronomical works that were circulating in circles that judged Columbus's claims when he got back to Spain included Jews and were using a lot of Jewish work. The question of whether Columbus himself was Jewish is much harder to answer. There's really no evidence apart from these squiggles. And those squiggles, I mean, it's very debated amongst experts in Hebrew paleography about whether it's even Hebrew at all, and if it is, what it says. And even if it is Hebrew, it could be a humanistic affectation. By that stage, when he wrote those letters, Columbus was quite an old man, and he'd undergone this process that I described of autodidacticism, of teaching himself. He'd taught himself Latin. He'd read a lot of scientific work, and of course it was a strong element in the humanist curriculum in Spain at the time was to learn Hebrew as well. So there could be lots of explanations for those squiggles, even if they are Hebrew, without ascribing Jewishness to Columbus. The Jewish Columbus, I'm afraid, I think is probably a bit like the Greek Columbus and the Catalan Columbus and the Polish guy. Everybody wants a piece of this guy, especially in the traditionally, until now. Now Columbus is a rather unpopular figure, but traditionally in the United States, to be able to claim Columbus as your compatriot was quite a bonus. I don't know who's next. Shall I go to this gentleman next, and then I'll come to you, sir? Yes.
Thank you. Did the Italian backers of Columbus get repaid?
No, thank you very much. That's a really great point. No, in fact, Gianotto Berardi loses everything. Because when Columbus comes back, it looks at first as if he's discovered something wonderful. And Berardi then invests the whole of his fortune in Columbus's next voyage. And it proves to be terribly disappointing because it turns out he hasn't got anywhere near China. The gold that he found on his first voyage turns out to be very small amounts. The only thing they can do to recover their money is enslave natives. And they start doing that. And then, of course, the king and queen of Spain say, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to enslave these people. They're subjects of the crown, and they're going to be Christians, so it's not lawful to enslave. So they have nothing. They've got no way of making money out of these discoveries. And Berardi dies in poverty. And he leaves this will. And it's such a pathetic document. You read it. He says, he appeals directly to Columbus. He calls him the Admiral, and he says, I beg the Lord Admiral to look after my poor, destitute daughter because I have nothing to leave her. And that's the last we ever hear of that girl. There's no other record of her. I'm afraid I don't think Columbus did the right thing by her at all. I may be doing him an injustice because there's an absence of evidence here, but which is never heard of again. Sir.
So who devised the master plan for the settlement of the Americas? And was Columbus involved with that planning? Or was he involved also in the methodology used to, if I would say this, devastate some of the indigenous...
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think the first thing to say is there was no master plan. There was just... It was just, everything was extemporized. But certainly, Columbus did envisage a commercial settlement in his, if we can use the word, discoveries, rather along the lines that were traditional in the history of medieval Genoa. Genoa was a kind of empire with all these trading cities scattered around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And I think Columbus, that was the model of empire that he knew, and I think that was what he had in mind. And of course, his efforts to do this were completely disastrous, because he built the first settlement in this, malaria, well, it wasn't malaria then, but it was, a malodorous swamp, and it proved extremely inconvenient, and there wasn't enough fresh water and stuff, and they had to move the settlement to a new location. He also assumed that it would be, I'm so sorry, madam, there's some people standing at the back who, please sit, because it's bad enough having to listen to me without having to stand as well. So he thought it would be necessary to exploit the indigenous population, to use their tribute and their labor. And he also introduced this system which was, in my opinion, an adaptation of an indigenous institution which came to be called the encomienda, according to which the labor, services, and tribute of native peoples were divided up amongst the Spanish colonists. And that certainly proved to be, at least, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Las Casas, thought that was one of the main reasons why the colonies failed in terms of maintaining the numbers of native peoples. Whether he was directly responsible for killing a lot of natives is much more doubtful, but it was one of the charges levied against him by the official Spanish prosecutors when he was taken back to Spain in chains and put on trial. And at the very least, he certainly turned a blind eye to many of the depredations and killings and beatings and other cruel excesses that were performed by some of his men. Of course, there's a famous incident where he gives a native slave girl to Michele di Cuneo, who then rapes and beats her, and he describes this act with tremendous self-satisfaction. I shudder to think, what a Senate hearing committee would make of it nowadays. So obviously, there were all these things went wrong. But of course, they were never part of a master plan. I mean, quite the reverse. If there was anything like a master plan, it depended on keeping those natives alive. Because without the natives, there was no labor, and there was no tribute. Indeed, you read the records back in Spain, the people in Spain are going absolutely crazy when they find these natives are dying. Because it's the last thing they want. In fact, they get very angry with the natives for dying. If only they had been more obliging, they would have survived. And in other words, it's not because the Spaniards were good or morally superior that they tried to keep these natives alive, and they went through all these trials of people for maltreating them and so on. That's not because they were good, it was because they needed them. So.
If the voyage was financed primarily by two wealthy Italian families, what was the involvement with the King of Spain?
Oh, well, you had to, in those days, you had to have a sponsor, a royal sponsor. Because if you didn't, and you did discover something, whom would it belong to? You had to have a sovereign entity behind you. And that's why all of these explorers, they go cap in hand from court to court, begging, different monarchs to back them. Of course, Columbus tried the Portuguese, the English. He also tried the Pope. He tried Innocent VIII. And eventually, he ended up working with the King and Queen of Spain. So it was essential to have royal patronage. And of course, the thing that they could give him personally that he needed were these titles of nobility. Only a king could make you a noble, or a pope. A sovereign had to bestow a title of nobility.
Italy had no king.
No, of course it was all, but I mean, the Genoese state could confer titles on its citizens. I mean, at the end of his life, Columbus gives a lot of money in his will to the Genoese state for the dowries of young girls, and I guess he was angling for some recognition from his native city. So. I'm sorry? Yes.
Before you mentioned that he only cared to arrive. So
yes.
What motivates him to come back 3 times?
Yes. Thank you very much. He wanted to arrive in a social sense. We do speak, don't we, of arriving socially, of making it to the social rank that you're seeking. So in that sense, he wanted to arrive. I don't think he cared, whether it was China or what. I mean, the difficulty was for Columbus that by the time he made his final voyage, he had promised his backers that he would find China. I don't think they were too worried about that, but he had staked his reputation on his promise to find China. It therefore became absolutely vital to him to prove that he'd done so. And a lot of the nonsense that you find in many of his later writings was a result of this desperate effort to represent what he'd found as China, or something very close to China. He keeps saying, I found more signs of civilized living amongst these natives, so I must be getting closer to China. When he encounters reports of these people whom the Tainos call the Kariba, he mishears it. He thinks they're saying Kaniba, and thinks, these are the people of the great Khan of China, a title which the ruler of China had not had since 1368. You know, you've got to remember that people in Europe knew very little about China in this period. Contact with China had been cut off in 1368 by the Ming Revolution, and most of their information was over 100 years out of date. Columbus mainly relied on Marco Polo for, information about China. So he was going back over and over again in the hope of proving, getting some evidence that he was at least near China. And of course the reason he returned home was that apart from the titles and his share of the proceeds that he was entitled to under the terms of his contract with the crown, he was much more interested in what was happening back at home in Europe. I mean, almost all those Spanish conquistadores were like that. They were more concerned to get home with their pockets full of profit than they were to stay in the New World and try to make a go of it. The only ones who stayed there were the ones who were too poor and unsuccessful to go home. If you've been to, Trujillo or somewhere like that, you see all these palaces built by returning conquistadores. That was the idea, that you would return home and make your life there. Have I answered your questions? Yes. Thank you. Ma'am.
Pardon my ignorance, but so when was the future American continent seen?
Oh.
As different from China?
Well, that it depends what you mean by different, because of course, I think it was pretty obvious. By 1499, so much of the coastline had been charted that it was pretty obvious that this was something new. Peter Martyr in 1510 called it a new world. Columbus himself called it another world, and that was in 1498 when he discovered the mouth of the, am I allowed to use the word discovered? He discovered the mouth of the Orinoco. And he realized that a river of such magnitude must have an immense hinterland behind it. But he was still hoping that he wasn't that far from China, and that the world was really small. Vespucci gets all this credit for having identified America as a new hemisphere. But Vespucci was also convinced that the world was much smaller than it really is. He drew on Columbus for almost all of his ideas. And he just thought that if he could go a little bit further, he would get to China. And in a sense, people went on thinking that throughout the 17th century. When Cartier was exploring Canada, he actually called his home La Chine, the home that he built on the banks of the St. Lawrence. He called it La Chine because he just thought, if only I can go a little bit further, I'm going to get there. And in the 1670s, when the English sent their first expeditions over the Appalachians, they thought, we won't have to go far because this continent can't be very big. And there's going to be China's going to be on the other side. When the Spaniards conquered New Mexico, that's a little bit earlier, of course, in 1598, they thought that they were really close to the Pacific. And then they discovered not only were they a long way from the Pacific, but they couldn't get there because of the mountains in the way. So in a strange way, it took really until the end of the 17th century before the inescapability of America as an obstacle on the way to Asia was finally fully recognized. And as for when it got the name America, well, I'm sure you know that because if you're an American taxpayer, you paid your share of the $10 million it cost the Library of Congress to buy the first world map that has the name America on it, the Waldseemüller map of 1507. Now, that's the first time the name America was bestowed on the hemisphere, and that was because Martin Waldseemüller and his colleague Matthias Ringmann were working on a new edition of Ptolemy, famous ancient geographer. They were working on this edition in Saint-Dié, which is, in the middle of nowhere. It's in the Vosges Mountains. And they had no idea really what was going on in the rest of the learned world. And they had this copy of the works of Vespucci. And they believed what Vespucci said about how he was the first person to discover this new world. And they hailed him as the new Ptolemy because they needed something new to distinguish their edition of Ptolemy from everybody else's. So they picked on Vespucci as the new Ptolemy, and they include on the map, they include this medallion in which he's depicted as the equal of Ptolemy. I mean, imagine what that was like in the Renaissance, to be the equal of one of the ancient sages. And so this entire write-up of Vespucci, including giving his name to the new hemisphere, was really the result of a series of mistakes made by these cosmographers in Saint-Dié. And in 1513, when Waldseemüller produces a new edition of the map, he's realized his mistake, and he takes the name America off the new map. And he includes a legend which says, these lands were discovered by Columbus by order of the King of Castile. But it was too late. By that time, the name America had already stuck. And I mean, this is irrelevant to your question, madam, but it's worth knowing this. I mean, as the director mentioned, I've also written a biography of Vespucci, which I think is much better than my book on Columbus, because I really did make some stunning, am I allowed to use the word discoverers, including, and this is the really amazing thing, that in his youth, Vespucci was a pimp. Now, don't you think that's great? This entire hemisphere and the world's greatest superpower in which we all have the privilege to live is named after a pimp.